Hello there, welcome. Well, we've come through the early part of the 70s. There's been funk, there's been disco, there's been decadent rock. So right now we're going to discuss punk and new wave. Oh, I gotta go pee, wait. Just kidding, just kidding. But that, of course, is what it's all about. The idea that punk begins to express an honesty, particularly about bodily functions, but also an honesty about the way the world actually is. You know, it's a bit of a con, you know? Joe Strummer in an interview said, cable TV's a con, the newspaper's a con, you're a con. Absolutely, it's a con. Punk helps to expose the con of the world. So what are its roots, musically speaking? Well, there's a fascination with the sort of garage sound of 60s rock bands earlier. You know, you think of the Kingsmans, Louie Louie. How about 96 Tears by Question Mark and the Mysterians? Dirty Water by the Standells. Those are the early things. But put yourself in Detroit, 68, 69. There's a band called Motor City 5, shortened to MC5. Now, these guys are troublemakers. They don't seem to fit in anywhere. You know, they ally themselves to the long hairs. They're taking on Republicans, Democrats. They're essentially taking on everybody. In fact, they have one of the most famous lines in rock and roll. It's the opening of a song. Kick out the jams. Let's play the clip. We can't say those words. Amazing energy. 7 years before the Sex Pistols, fantastic footage. The MC5, Kick Out the Jams. Now, on their first album, they had liner notes that are interesting unto themselves. Their manager was known as the King Hippie in Detroit, a guy called John Sinclair. Now, besides being the King Hippie, he also was the founder of the White Panthers. Now, don't confuse this with white supremacists. There was a 10-point program printed on the gatefold sleeve of the MC5's first album. I quote, 1, full endorsement and support of the Black Panther Party. 2, total assault on the culture by any means necessary. 3, free exchange of energy and materials. 4, free food, clothes, housing, dope, music, bodies. Oh, and medical care. Free access to information, free time for space for all humans, free all schools and all structures from corporate rule, free all prisoners everywhere. Why not? Free all soldiers at once. No more conscripted armies. And number 10, free the people from their leaders. Leaders suck. You know, in total observance of think for yourself and question authority, MC5 lead the way. They didn't lead the way, though, in terms of capitalism. On that particular album, they actually printed the word, well, I can't say it, but mofo. It was on the liner notes. They had taken it out. But a record chain in Detroit called Hudson's, as influential as Tower Records is today, was up in arms that they had actually printed that word on the liner notes. So they took the product out. MC5 decided to take out a full-page commercial in their own newspaper. They had a picture of their lead singer, and underneath they had Hudson's. Hudson's wasn't happy, especially because the MC5 had not signed it the MC5, they'd actually signed it Elektra Records. So what did Hudson's do? They threw out all the Elektra product in their stores. This was like peeing off Tower Records today. Elektra was not happy. They had to explain to the band that they could say what they want, just don't put Elektra's name on the bottom of it. The guy that actually signed the MC5 was a chap called Danny Fields from Elektra. He had gone down to Detroit to see the band, and he actually happens to catch the opening act. He likes them too. He signs them up. They're Iggy Pop and the Stooges.
See that
TVI, 1969 by the Stooges, led by Iggy. The Muse, the punk muse, it's not called punk then, but 1969, 1970, you can sort of trace it over towards New York. New York's picking up on a kind of seedier side of things. Velvet Underground are definitely laying the groundwork. They're exploring such themes as heroin, male prostitution, transvestites, anything that seemingly has gone along on the Lower East Side. You're having bands like New York Dolls, totally exploring dressing up as girls. This is definitely going in the face of traditional rock ethics. There's a couple of clubs, Max's Kansas City, and then there's a famous club called CBGB's that's even in the news today. Well, in the early 1970s, they were sort of tapping into a new music element, sort of exposing art and rock. And they didn't really have a name for it then, but about 10 years ago, I traveled down to CBGB's to interview the man behind these new music nights, as you'll hear. His name is Hilly Crystal.
Well, December 73 is when I started, and I'd say by the end of 75, I guess the middle of 75, we had a festival for the top 40 unrecorded rock bands then, New York rock bands. And we had about 70 bands literally that nobody ever heard of, so that's really what started it off.
So during that era, what were some of the bands that were playing here at the time that were your main attractions?
Well, during the early era, there was the Talking Heads, Television, the Ramones, and the Stilettos, from which Blondie came from, and then Blondie. Patti Smith, and then we had the Dead Boys.
Classic footage. CBGB's also goes down in history as the worst washrooms in any rock and roll venue on the planet. It didn't have a name, this new music, so where'd it come from? Where'd it get the label punk? Well, there was a fanzine going on outside of the CBGB's element, and they had adopted the name punk. I quote from a book, Please Kill Me, The Uncensored Oral History of Punk by Legs McNeil. And this is what Legs McNeil has to say. I saw the magazine that John Holstrom wanted to start as a Dictators album come to life. Dictators is one of the bands emerging during the scene. On the inside sleeve of the record was a picture of the Dictators hanging out in a White Castle hamburger stand, and they were dressed in black leather jackets. Even though we didn't have black leather jackets, the picture seemed to describe us perfectly. Wise guys. So I thought the magazine should be for other effed up kids like us. Kids who grew up believing only in the Three Stooges. Kids that had parties when their parents were away and destroyed the house. You know, kids that stole cars and had fun. So I said, why don't we call it punk? And punk it was. So out of this New York scene, two great ambassadors emerge. Patti Smith, providing a kind of female equation to what's going on to all this male testosterone, and the Ramones. And Patti Smith and the Ramones go to England in the same way that Bill Haley had done in 1957. Their tour begins to inspire a brand new generation of punk rockers. It hits England in the mid-1970s, and the Ramones, well, we idolize them today. Classic cut, Sheena is a punk rocker. Well, the Muse is now firmly embedded in the UK. We'll get into that in a minute. The Sex Pistols lead the way, and we got some classic Sex Pistols stuff coming up for you in a minute. Back in a moment. So the era is around about 1975, 1976 England. There's a scene going on, particularly around the Marquee Club in London. Now, everyone traditionally thinks that the Sex Pistols is the first one on the scene. Not so. The first true punk single and the first true punk video actually comes from a band called The Damned. New Rose is the track, and we got it for you right now. This is The Damned, New Rose.
See the sun it shines. Don't get too close or it'll burn your eyes. Don't you run away that way. You can come back another day. I've got a new rose, I've got a good. Yes, I knew that I always would. I can't stop to mess around. I got a brand new rose in town.
But the Sex Pistols' achievement would totally eclipse what The Damned had done just there. Now you need a bit of a setup here, first of all, for the Sex Pistols. The man that acts as the Svengali, the manipulator of the Sex Pistols, is a man called Malcolm McLaren. Now McLaren had also gone over to New York, and at the tail end of the New York Dolls, he had got involved with managing them. So he'd learned a little bit about the showbiz and record management. And he'd come back, and as legend has it, he meets the Sex Pistols, but they're in need of a lead singer. They discover John Lydon, later to be known as Johnny Rotten. Apparently they meet in a pub on the King's Road, and they come back to the shop, and he has to sing an audition to the jukebox. Anyway, he gets the gig, and they rehearse as much as possible. Well, most of the other Sex Pistols, particularly Steve Jones, are thieves. I mean, like they are stealing gear. And there's a great moment when Steve Jones says that when he legitimately becomes a musician, lugging gear up the steps was no fun. He didn't mind doing it if he was stealing it, but having to do it to play, that was no fun. Anyway, McLaren gets a deal for the Sex Pistols with EMI. Before the record is released, though, they're on a very famous program in the UK. They appear on this show, and they are being interviewed by one Bill Grundy. It's December 1976. Swear words are exchanged. 1, 2, 20, 30, a couple anyway. Next day, there is an amazing headline that appears in the newspapers. The Filth and the Fury. Let me read from the Daily Mirror, December the 2nd, 1976. A pop group shocked millions of viewers last night with the filthiest language heard on British television. The Sex Pistols, leaders of the new punk rock cult, hurled a string of 4-letter obscenities as interviewer Bill Grundy on Thames TV's Family Tea Time show Today. The Thames switchboard was flooded with protests. EMI drops them, A&M Records get them for a while, but they end up on Virgin Records. The career of the Sex Pistols is now fully launched, and the media is directly involved. There is a huge relationship between the media, the music, the art, the whole performance, Dadaistic to the nth degree. Sex Pistols for you.
Thought you'd gotten rid of us, didn't you? But you were wrong, old bean, because we're back with a vengeance. God save the Queen, my son.
Lights! Now!
What do you think of the Sex Pistols, Brad?
Brilliant.
Sick.
I am an anti-Christ. I am an anarchist. Don't know what I want, but I know how to get it. I want to destroy, possibly.
No order. Do what you want.
I wanna be
I educated myself in my own way. I just wouldn't listen.
future for you. Back to the Queen. We need that man.
They tried to finish us off, but they won.
God Save the Queen actually comes out in 1977, and John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, says he swears he didn't know it was Queen Elizabeth's Jubilee. It just so happened to coincide, but the media loved that element of it. Now, the Sex Pistols now have trouble actually going on tour, and the Anarchy UK tour, in fact, gets cancelled to some degree. It's a huge tour, but in reality, it's only 3 dates. The Clash go on the road. But where the Sex Pistols go, they inspire. There's a fabulous movie out right now called 24-Hour Party People, and they talk about the Sex Pistols coming to Manchester, and it's very much like the Police being here in Toronto. Only 10 people actually were there, but 5,000 actually recall the event. The same things to have occurred with the Sex Pistols in Manchester, but a bunch of guys that were there were totally inspired. The Buzzcocks are their name.
Like any other, what do I get? I only want a friend who stays to the end. What do I get? What do I get? Oh, what do I get? What do I get? Oh,
Whole bunch of bands start to emerge. X-Ray Specs, later on out of Vancouver, you get DOA further on down the west coast, you get Black Flag eventually. But the band that really rivals the Sex Pistols is the Clash. They had gone on the road with the Pistols, but the Clash are far more musically adept. They dabble in all kinds of musical styles. A little bit of rockabilly, a little bit of dub, a bunch of reggaes. They position themselves as true outlaws in a romantic sense. That idea of the con, of realizing that society is ripping us off in some way, somehow. And this is what punk does. It does it for us all. It sort of rips away the layers to show how, to some degree, capitalism is manipulating things from behind the scenes, unbeknownst to all of us. For the punks, it was an idea of revealing exactly what's going on, how they did it. The Clash were the most successful at this. One of their first hits was Tommy Gun. Now here's an interesting footnote. The first album by The Clash, which was released in the UK, the rights went to CBS here in the United States, and they deemed it was not radio worthy, so they weren't going to get any exposure for it, so they didn't want to release it. What do you know? It has become, at the time, it became one of the most successful imports ever in the history of CBS records. New Wave eventually usurps punk. We'll get to that right after this. Now, by 1978, the position that punk occupies on the throne of music has been usurped. New Wave comes in. Punk should have been the umbrella title and everything a subgenre off it, but in fact, New Wave becomes the title that accompanies all kinds of styles of music. So, quick little breakdown for you. So you got punk here, sorry, you got New Wave there, you got one element, punk, true to its roots. You got electronic. People like OMD, Human League, Ultravox. You then got rockabilly. Yeah, they even included rockabilly at the time. People like, come on, prompt me, Stray Cats. You then got a kind of pub rock. People like Joe Jackson. You got that going on. You got novelty records. Hit Me With Your Rhythm Stick, you remember that? Ian Jury and the Blockheads, and you got a little bit of Devo in the novelty and a little bit of the electronic as well. All of these elements make up what came to be known as New Wave for whatever reasons. Radio programmers, of course, wouldn't play punk. Everyone was scared of it. New wave was far more acceptable. Electronic in particular, because electronic stays true to a 4/4 beat. And electronic begins to take off in the discos that are switching over from true disco records into a far more interesting element. So a quick history lesson about electronic. So the first true electronic instrument is the theremin, Leon theremin. Essentially, it's two posts, two antennae hooked up, creating a magnetic field by radio frequencies. It's the only instrument that you don't actually have to touch to create a sound. It stands there like that. Leon theremin would put his hand in, break the magnetic field, and you'd get the pitch, and you could actually alter the volume as well. This was an incredible breakthrough in 1918, and through the 1920s, Leon theremin would go on tour and show what the theremin could actually do. In the 1930s, you have the development of magnetic tape and tape recorders, and the Germans begin, especially during the Second World War, begin to develop the tape recorder. This allows found sounds to actually come to the forefront. People like John Cage actually dabbling with found sounds and tape recorders. You then have things like, here in Canada, the invention of the sack butt, which is a very early synthesizer. You have the electronic piano. But you have the sounds also coming through main media. You have strange sounds in the movie Forbidden Planet, 1956, the first truly electronic soundtrack. For television, the first truly electronic theme song on TV is Doctor Who. If you know the Doctor Who thing, developed by the BBC Electronic Workshop. But by the mid-1960s, there's been the development of a synthesizer that will change things, Moog. Robert Moog develops the Moog synthesizer. People like Keith Emerson, originally in Nice, the band Nice, and later on Emerson, Lake and Palmer, would develop the use of the Moog. Other bands would as too. But in 1968, there's a breakthrough record for the Moog synthesizer. It is Switched On Bach. The composer is Walter Wendy Carlos. He would have a sex change and be known as Wendy. That's fascinating unto itself, but let's stick with the synthesizer stuff. Not only would he release the album Switched On Bach in 1968, he would also do A Clockwork Orange, the soundtrack to A Clockwork Orange. Switched On Bach would sell 1 million copies, it would win 3 Grammys, and increase demand for this new instrument, the synthesizer. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to interview Jean-Michel Jarre, no slouch in the area of electronics himself. He puts in context what Switched On Bach and Walter Wendy Carlos actually achieved.
Everything started by Switched On Bach, because a lot of people said, oh, this is an incredible machine able to replace an orchestra, and that was not the point. For me, what Walter Carlos did for Clockwork Orange is much more important for the future of electronic music than Switched On Bach, in my opinion. Because he used technology to create a kind of sound that had never been existed before.
The beast you see behind me is the thing that started it all. Built for me by Robert Moog in 1968, I guess. Eventually, when we went to the States, Bob came along to the first one of the performances that we did, and he was completely staggered. I mean, he couldn't, first of all, he couldn't believe how somebody could develop that amount of confidence in this piece of equipment, how somebody could be mad enough to take it on the road in the first place, you know. So I think he saw the possibilities of making production models and things.
You can see how big that beast actually is, a huge, huge machine. But by 1971, the Mini Moog has been introduced. And this begins to change everything because now bands can actually take it on the road with them. There are a number of bands experimenting with the sounds coming out of the Moog, particularly out of the German market. You've got people like Can, Tangerine Dream, and there's a producer called Giorgio Moroder. And Giorgio Moroder attaches this new metallic synthesizer sound to disco music, and a classic electronic track for the disco genre. It's kind of one of the fountainheads for where the electronic scene would go. Here it is, I Feel Love, Donna Summer. And with that sound, there's a new sense of modernism that comes into play as well. And it's an unusual sense of modernism. It's modernism sort of taken from a 1930s viewpoint. It's this idea of futurism, but seen from the past. Synthesizers began to get criticized for being soulless and non-star orientated. And people can just hide behind the keyboard and not do anything except twiddle knobs and play little notes. But by 1977, there's a breakthrough track, and everyone wants to borrow from it. It's a classic in the genre. It is Trans-Europe Express. It comes from another German band, Kraftwerk.
Rendezvous on Champs-Élysées, leave Paris in the morning with TEE. Trans-Europe Express. Trans-Europe Express.
So how does punk borrow from this? Well, the punk ethic of do it yourself, get up and make music is now possible because you've got machines that will allow you to create music. So even though you're not musically trained, you don't need to be Sid Vicious and pick up the bass. You can pick up the new Mini Moog. So you're having a spate of bands dabbling in electronic music, influenced by people like Kraftwerk, Roxy Music, Tangerine Dream, bands like OMD, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, Human League, Ultravox. All of these tracks are able to be played in the disco elements. Now, I was a disco DJ in 1979 and I began to play these tracks and people are outraged. They just automatically label it as punk, not understanding, oh, well, this is art, this is progressive music. But of course, the club I was working at, they didn't want anything to do with that. A story came down from the Vancouver Sun. They had sent a reporter down there and they had got a photograph. And they happened to have chosen the only 4 new wave punk rockers in the club. But I played a particular track and my people danced. The picture was in the paper. I lost my job the next day. The headline underneath it was New Wave Punk Rockers Take Over Pharaohs in Gastown. That was it. I was out of a job, but I was a purveyor of new music at the time. The track that I played to get him on the dance floor was this one, Flying Lizards, Money.
The best things in life are free, but you can give them to the birds and bees. I want money. That's what I want. That's what I want. That's what I want. Your love gives me such a thrill. But your love won't pay my bills. I want money.
And matched to this element, there's the rise of new labels. And in the electronic genre, there was a guy called Daniel Miller, and he wanted to release a record. And he had done a track called Warm Leatherette. On the flip side was TVOD, if you remember that. He set up his own label. It was Mute Records. Mute Records would later go on to establish the career of Depeche Mode. We'll get into indie labels in a moment. Now, this idea of being able to do it yourself was totally important. It's the keystone to what punk rock new wave was all about. Up to this point, let's put the background in context here. You've got ABBA. You've got the success of Fleetwood Mac. You've got the success of the Eagles. Punk rock showed you that you didn't need the financial resources of the big labels to do it. You didn't even need the musicianship. You could just get up there and do it yourself and make it real. And not only just from a musician's point of view, but from a business point of view as well. You got 50 pounds, maybe you can press a 7-inch single and make it happen. So you have this sudden explosion of labels like Stiff that released Ian Dury. Their logo was, if it ain't stiff, it ain't worth a... Then you had people like Rough Trade. And then up in Manchester, Factory Records. We'll get into Factory in a minute. But down in Coventry, you had an incredible scene emerging around one guy, a guy called Jerry Dammers. And the reggae beat had already been sort of utilized in such elements by the Police. Remember the Police and their reggae stuff? The Clash had borrowed from reggae. But what the new wave guys up in Coventry wanted to do was mine something even older, ska. They wanted to go back to the roots of Jamaica. They wanted the energy, that energy that punk had, they wanted to find it in ska. And so they launched Two Tone Records. And Two Tone was a reference to two things. First of all, it was a reference to the idea that black and white could get along and that something was going on, but it was also a reference to the two-tone tonic suits that the skinheads from the 60s used to wear. They're the suits that kind of flash. You put it in the light and it flashes a little bit. In skinhead parlance, that's called a two-tone tonic suit. So these guys borrowed from the skinheads who had originally borrowed from the ska beat as well. By the end of the 70s, Two Tone is launched, and around it, a whole scene begins to emerge. Let's take you back in time and take a look at the Specials.
Jerry, you probably were the one responsible for starting the Two Tone label as well.
Well, not really. That was a combination of people.
How did it come about?
Well, we just had to have a label to release our own record on because it was an independent release, Gangsters. And Horace and I designed the logo and thought of the name.
We just came to the conclusion if you want something doing, it's best to do it yourself, which I think was what the whole punk ethic was about in the first place, really.
Has it bothered you at all that the media seems to have lumped the Selector, the Specials, and Madness into one label and just called it Two Tone rather than realizing that each band is individual with individual personalities and things like that?
Well, the Specials and the Selector are on the Two Tone label. Madness did a one-off single, Prince, for Two Tone and then signed to Stiff. It doesn't exactly bother us because it gives us some identity and it also gives the kids some identity. In Britain particularly, there's been a whole sort of movement around it as well, which is really what we wanted to happen.
We saw their name on a toilet door in London and went down to see them, liked them, said, do you want to do some concerts with us? And they did.
Chalky sugs of Chelsea written on a wall, and I thought.
Well, they played in a pub that we go in all the time in London. We hadn't really heard of them, just went down to see them, and they were really similar to us.
The energy being emitted by the two-tone bands was incredible. One of the greatest concerts I've seen in my life, and I've seen lots, but the one that I always put at the front is a concert by the Specials. It's about 1980 in Vancouver. It's on a night I'm not working, DJing. The Specials have been on tour with the Police. Police at this time are on their way to becoming one of the world's biggest bands. Now, the Specials had opened for them at the Pacific Coliseum. It was so fantastic that the promoter, Periscope, wanted to book an immediate date on a down day, Sunday. He books the Commodore Ballroom. The word goes out in the community, and it's a unique element for the Vancouver community that all the various tribes, whether they be rockabillys, punks, skinheads, whatever, would come together and support the new music that's happening at the time. So we all come to see the Specials. We were blown away. They hit the stage at 150 miles an hour and only got faster. It was the most incredible energy. It was indicative of what could be achieved and how music was to be played. It was the idea of, well, let's get away from the laid-back California sound. As they said, FR, let's dance. That's what it was about. If that scene's going on in Coventry, there's another exciting scene going on in Manchester. There, Factory Records are founded. The guy behind it, no accident, I think, is a media guru, Tony Wilson. He's already got a TV show, he's already exposing bands. He decides he's going to set up a label. They called it Factory Records. I think he saw the sign on a wall, Factory. Let's call it Factory. First signing is an obscure art band, Durruti Column, led by Vinnie Riley. But they gained success with a band originally called Warsaw and ends up being called Joy Division. Joy Division, later to evolve into New Order, and Factory Records have a profound effect on the music that occurs in the 1980s. We'll get to that in a minute. But the romance surrounding Factory Records and Joy Division was so profound, it changed many people's lives, mine included. The lyrical content of Joy Division, supplied by the lead singer Ian Curtis, seemed to mine a romantic quality. It also touched on themes of isolation, alienation, individuality, themes that were not really being expressed in any forms of music, whether they be punk, ska, or even traditional rock. It seemed that Ian Curtis and Joy Division had caught the moment for those of us that seemed to have, for whatever reason, a cloud over our heads. We all seemed to have these long coats, and we had a rain cloud over our head. Coupled with this was the graphic complement of Peter Saville that did all the Factory Records stuff. And he would be anti-graphic, minimalistic, borrowing from Italian futurists of the 30s, those futurists of the 30s again. Minimal. There wouldn't be band photos on the cover like traditional guys. It would be like some obscure element, some kind of, dare I say it, art. Joy Division in particular. Their first album, it seemed to have a little digital printout of some kind of one of those soundboard things. By accident, it turned out to be the sound of a dying star off in space. And then they would release Love Will Tear Us Apart. Love Will Tear Us Apart ended up being the #1 song of 1980 as voted by Melody Maker. It would be a song that would change many people's lives, mine included. On the front cover of the 12-inch of Love Will Tear Us Apart is a shot of a statue of a fallen angel. May 1980, on the eve of their North American tour, with a date in Toronto already announced, tickets printed, they're a rare commodity now. On the eve of that tour, Ian Curtis hung himself, apparently listening to Iggy Pop and watching a Fassbinder movie. Shortly after his death, their greatest work is released, cryptically called Closer. The graphic supplied by Peter Saville shows Mary Magdalene humbling herself before the body of Christ. All of this creates this myth element about Joy Division and Factory Records. The myth of it all becomes as important as the music and everything else, and we project it into it. It becomes so important that to some degree, it becomes bigger than anything else that's going on at the time. That record changed my life. The 12-inch hangs on my wall, and I wear it with pride. More after this. There was a real sense of darkness towards the end of the 1970s going in the 80s. You know, we had Margaret Thatcher just waiting around the corner in the United Kingdom. Also Ronald Reagan just around the corner as well. But also there were 3 tragic deaths. In 1977, the king of rock and roll dies, Mr. Elvis Presley. He succumbs. And then in 1979, we have the death of Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols, he was out on bail, 24 hours. He had been arraigned for apparently murdering his girlfriend. He then dies from a drug overdose. And then in 1980, in New York City, John Lennon is murdered by Mark David Chapman. Chapman apparently earlier in the day reading the great novel about adolescence, Catcher in the Rye. So it's a dark moment. It begins to brighten up as the 80s go on. Now, if you get the idea that I'm passionate about that period, you're absolutely right. You know, it was a period that changed so many of us. It established new labels. We were excited about the music, and you're hard-pressed to sort of find that today. It seemed that something was going on. Sex Pistols broke up, but in the mid-90s, they had a chance to get back together again and make some money. It was no accident that the tour was called the Filthy Lucre Tour. So they do the British stuff and then they come to North America, and I am honored to ask to go down to Denver, the opening date of the tour, to interview the Sex Pistols. Now, I'd already done a documentary on punk. I'm passionate about the stuff, and I thought, oh, this is great. I'm going to get the definitive Sex Pistols interview. I'm fully armed. There's an opening gambit that you play in interviews. You know, I've done a lot of them, and there's 2 ways to do it. You know, you can have a throwaway question that doesn't really mean anything, that gets everyone comfortable, or you can have a really tough question that throws down the gauntlet, and you're sort of wanting to get a conversation going. Well, I thought I was going to get a conversation going. Let's see what happened. The magic of the Sex Pistols really lies in the potency of the image that you guys created 20 years ago.
Well, what an arsehole you are.
Maybe.
Something to do with an image of great fool.
You
to
don't
do with
think
the
so?
damn songs.
You don't think so?
No, I don't. End of interview.
End of interview? All right.
No, look, you've upset him now, look.
If this had started out as an interview, question answer, that would have been fine. But it's not. This is all about you, your ego, and your preconceptions. I ain't interested.
Well, it's not about my ego, and it's not about my preconceptions.
Don't talk to me.
Oh, come on, sit back down, come on.
We'll have a cup of tea. Oh, you've upset him
now.
now. You've really done it now.
How much of what John says represents what you guys feel?
He's our leader. He's our spokesperson.
Get none of it at the same time.
Yes. He's a spokesperson for...
You can't leave punk without letting you know what else is going on in the world. Well, in 1979, an album called London Calling is released by The Clash. These are the individuals that would actually lead the way into the 1980s. These are the ones that position themselves as the outlaws. They dabble in all kinds of music strands, as I mentioned. So much so that in 1989, at the end of the 80s decade, there was a music critics poll. What was the most influential album of the 80s? It was 1979's London Calling. The album jacket borrowed actually from Elvis Presley. The video borrowed from the Sex Pistols' God Save the Queen, a boat going down the Thames. It didn't matter because it was a classic cut and it announced what was going on with the world and the new style of music. London Calling, title track for you right now. As they say in the song, phony Beatlemania has bitten the dust. Make it real, make it worthwhile. Next time we're going to talk about something that's totally unreal, music television. See you later.